Okay, this is Miss Sailor. We are here with Historiography, Primary Sources and Secondary Sources Part 2 video. So I want to talk to you guys about primary sources. What is a primary source? Primary sources are immediate. They're first-hand accounts of a specific topic from people who had a direct connection with it. So, these are things that can include laws and other original documents. An excellent example is obviously the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution. These are considered primary documents. Newspaper reports by reporters who witnessed an event or who quote people who did. Speeches, diaries, letters, and interviews. What the people involved said or wrote. A good example would be oral histories, because it is that person's interpretation of an event, so therefore it is a primary source. Original research is considered a primary source. Data sets, survey data such as the census or economic statistics are considered primary sources. So when your parents do the census, that is considered a primary source which you can pull up and look at and use the data for. Other things that are obvious, I think, as primary sources are things like photographs, videos, and audio that capture an event. So the photographs of like Lincoln giving the Gettysburg Address. Videos and audios that capture events specifically are considered primary sources. So, you also have secondary sources. So, secondary sources are just a step removed from primary sources, though they often quote or otherwise use primary sources. They can cover the same topic, but they add a layer of interpretation and analysis on top. So, think of things like most books about a specific topic. You have a lot of books on history or specific historical topics. So you may read there's a good one out on the Civil War, a lot of books by McPherson. They are about the Civil War, but they are considered secondary sources. They are not a primary source. Obviously, McPherson, the author, did not live during the Civil War. So this is his interpretation of the events that happened during the Civil War. Analysis or interpretations of data. I used census data in my thesis. So I interpreted the data. So therefore, parts of my thesis are used as a secondary source because I was interpreting the primary source that was the census data that I used to break down statistical values of the town I was researching. Scholarly or other articles about a topic, especially by people not directly involved. You see this a lot, less maybe with some of your high school teachers, maybe some, but in college, when you have professors, most of your professors do scholarly research on the side for the universities or colleges that they're working for. And they will write articles and things that will be published for other people in their field of work or just people interested in the topic will want to read. These are considered secondary sources. A good example I like to think that I may cover later in class, I haven't fully decided yet. There was a historian that was a professor for me at SFA. He specialized in James Monroe. So he wrote a few different scholarly articles specifically around James Monroe's policies as president of the United States. So his articles are excellent sources of information, especially if you don't know a lot about James Monroe presidency, but they're not considered a primary source. They're considered a secondary source because obviously this professor was not alive during the presidency of James Monroe. He's only looked at primary source documents. Also, you have documentaries. Though often they may include photos or video portions that can be considered parts of primary sources. Documentaries are an excellent example of what is kind of this mix between what is a secondary source and what is a secondary source or a primary source that is being used like a secondary source. There will be a few documentaries that I may see if I can find the YouTube links that I would like you guys just to look at and kind of watch some scenes from them, because they have excellent primary source stuff inside of them that are going to have photographs and videos that you can look at. Obviously, video did not show up until early 1900. So anything before that, a film, obviously photographs, you will see photographs of the Civil War and things like that because photos had come around by that time. But documentaries are a good example of having primary sources within a secondary source. So you also have you can see, food for thought. Sometimes a primary source is a secondary source. So when does this happen? And how does this happen? So whether something is a primary or secondary source often depends on the topic. But before I count that, let's do this real quick. So these are examples of primary sources. You have artwork, diary, interviews, letters. A performance, like a stage performance, is considered a primary source, like ballet, poetry, and even a treaty. So, like the Treaty of Paris. There are many of them, but these are considered primary source documents. Secondary sources are things like articles critiquing that piece of artwork, books about the specific subject, as I covered. Biography is considered a secondary source, unless that biography is written specifically by the person himself. Then it kind of gets into the might be a primary source as a secondary source nature. Dissertations are considered secondary sources. This would be theses or dissertations because they are using primary sources to interpret and thus discuss. So therefore they are considered secondary sources. The review of that play or ballet that you've gone to is considered a secondary source. And then writing an essay about that treaty is considered a secondary source because you're using a primary source to write it. So let's go back. When is a primary source a secondary source? It often depends on the topic and the use of it. A biography textbook would be considered a secondary source if in the field of a biography, since it describes and interprets the science, but makes no original contribution to it. On the other hand, if the topic is science education in the history of textbooks, textbooks can be used as a primary source to look at how they've changed over time. So this is how a primary source is a secondary source. I realize there is a spelling error in that slide and I apologize. So for your homework, you should still be reading chapter 1. Email me if you're experiencing any issues or have any questions. Let me know, okay?